When I was a senior in college, my cousin was murdered. He was on his way back to college after Christmas break and never arrived. He was missing for 5 days, and then some kids playing in the woods found his body. He had been abducted and stabbed to death. I remember that time like it was a very dark and cold fog, the kind of fog that takes everything familiar and makes it seem different and eerie and scary. Of course, I knew that murder existed in the universe, but it had never occurred to me that it would happen to somebody I knew and loved, who was kind and gentle, who loved Jesus, and who was doing something perfectly ordinary, like going back to college after Christmas break. I assumed that the kind of people who got murdered were in gangs or on drugs or lived in the inner city. So it was a very bewildering and confusing time. But I was a Christian, and Mark was a Christian, so that gave us a foundation under my feet. That wouldn't have been there otherwise. I believed that Mark was in heaven with Jesus. I believed that was good, and I'm glad to have had that stability in what was a very unstable time. And yet, at the same time, even God had become part of that mysterious strangeness. I played the piano for Mark's funeral, and one of my cousins sang an old hymn called Children of the Heavenly Father. There's a line in the second verse that says, from all evil things he spares them. And I about choked when I was playing that line because God had not spared Mark from evil. Mark was his child, and I could not think of anything more evil than being abducted at night and stabbed to death. Well, I was too fragile at that time to really try to explore that dissonance, and the Christian community I was in didn't really support that kind of questioning. They were very supportive of us personally, but we spent a lot of time talking about how God is sovereign and how we don't know what God is doing, but it's good. And so I didn't have kind of the support that I needed to be able to really try to answer the question of why didn't God spare Mark? So I just pushed it out of the way and didn't think about it. But even though I wasn't thinking about it, it came back in other ways, especially in fear and anger. The fear makes sense since God had proven very strongly that he was not interested in my number one interest, which was staying alive. And the anger was really related to when I heard stories about miracles people had, or heard people saying if you just pray the right way, or, say the right words, or in the right posture, that God will do these wonderful things for you. And I had to kind of choke on that because God had not done for my cousin what any good parent would do for their child, which is fight to protect them. God had chosen not to protect his own child, and I didn't know how to deal with that. Today, I remember that Jesus himself was murdered. And when he was dying, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? He didn't say, well, I know that you're sovereign, so I'll just sit here and I'll wait to find out what's going on. He just said openly and honestly what he was feeling, and he said it without fear that his Father wouldn't like it. And so finally, years later, I got the same courage, and I said, my God, why did you forsake my cousin? And in forsaking him, you forsook everyone who loved him. And then I sat back to wait for an answer. I really wanted to know. It was sometime later that I was talking with a cousin, and we were once again going through everything that had happened and just trying to sort it out. And two things stuck out for me that had never seemed important before. One was that both the police officers who investigated the crime scene and the coroner who did the autopsy said there was no sign of struggle. My cousin did not fight for his life. And the second thing was that the killer seems to have gone crazy and stabbed him long after he was dead. He was still stabbing him. The coroner said he had never seen so many stab wounds in a body. And suddenly I had one of those moments of holy mystery where I had this, deep in my soul, this kind of an awakening, and I realized that there was an explanation for both of those characteristics, and that was the holy and strong presence of God. I came to believe that my cousin did not fight for his life because God's presence was so strong that he did not want to or need to, that he was willing to surrender to the God who loved him, even when that surrender involved his very life. Today, I remember one more thing. I remember that when Jesus was hanging on the cross, he looked down and he saw his mother, the grieving family left behind, and he had compassion on her, and he reached down to take care of her needs. And I'm grateful that God is still having compassion on the grieving family left behind.